Everybody's on. Oh, this is great. Hi. It's so good to see you all again. And we finally get to meet each other. I am so happy to have our inaugural board meeting, one of the first of what I hope are several over the next few years, obviously, 2 a year. And so I thought we sent you materials, and I thought we would start out today with some introductions. Um, I had individual conversations, of course, with everybody, but I think we haven't introduced, and you all got each other's backgrounds, but we really haven't introduced each other. So I thought that that would be a great thing to do. Um, let's see, I will start. You know me, I'm Annette Stanton. I've been chair of the department. It's my honor for about almost 2 years now. In another month, it will be 2 years. And I joined UCLA 18 years ago as a full professor. I've been public university all the way for all of my education. I grew up in a tiny town in Kansas, that like a no stoplight town, really small. Um, we have twice as many undergraduate majors as my town had. As my town had population, I should say. And so, we have just a tremendous number of undergraduate majors compared to my town. I went to University of Kansas as an undergraduate, went on to Connecticut for graduate school, then went to another university for my first job, and then University of Kansas, not knowing that I was a KU alum, hired me back and hired me. And so I was there for many years and then was hired here 18 years ago. So I have just absolutely loved being here at UCLA. I first lived in Los Angeles when my PhD is in clinical psychology, and I also have a specialization in health psychology. But my clinical internship was here at LA County, that other university hospital across town. Um, and it was a great experience, I have to say. It was a little bit like being thrown into the pool, not completely knowing how to swim, but it was really a fantastic experience. And then I came out when I was a professor at University of Kansas. I was asked to come out for a sabbatical here, to do some collaborative research with a medical oncologist primarily, and then also some psychologists in the department. And so I came out on sabbatical, and then when I was about to come out for another sabbatical, they said, well, would you consider coming out for good? And it really was, I have to say, my dream job in terms of the quality of the university, the incredible collaborative opportunities. And so that's how I got here, and I'm loving it, and I will stay. As I know you all love UCLA, and we'll hear a little bit from each of you. But first, some of you know all of our development office in the life sciences, and some of you don't. So I will first turn it over to Olivia to introduce herself and all of our development team.
Thanks so much, Annette. Hi, everybody. I am Olivia Lamb. I'm the Executive Director of Development for our Division of Life Sciences, and I know that I've communicated with each one of you, so it's so wonderful to meet you today. And I've been in this role for about since September, and previously I led fundraising over at our UCLA Extension School as well. And we have here our team, and I'll let Janice and Caroline self-introduce themselves as well, and then we'll jump back over to Annette.
Okay, Janice.
Oh, I thought Caroline was going to go next. Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Janice Shintaku. I've been at UCLA almost 9 years and started out in college development managing donor events. About 2 years ago, I switched positions to become a frontline fundraiser and a development officer, and have really been enjoying my time working with all of the alumni and donors for, I focused on psychology, but now my portfolio includes some of the other departments and centers, institutes in life sciences. So it's great to see all of you.
Caroline?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline. I have been, with the Division of Life Sciences and at UCLA for 2.5 years in my role as Director of Development. And I work with psychology along with all of the other departments. And it is my pleasure to meet with Annette regularly with our team and figure out how we can help psychology, reach more people, showcase the amazing research of our faculty and our amazing students. So pleasure to be here. Kelly, do you want to introduce yourself too?
Sure. My name is Kelly O'Leary. I'm the Director of Events for College Development. I started at the same time Janice did, so coming up on 9 years somehow. I work specifically with the Division of Life Sciences, so it's nice to put names to faces. I know I've sent invitations and confirmations and all kinds of emails to all of you, so nice to meet you.
Okay, so now let's go around for us to have everyone introduce him or herself, and I'm going to just go across my screen. So I see Andrew first. Andrew, do you want to say something about yourself? You are muted. There you go.
Okay, so hi, Annette, and of course, a shout out to my old friend, Jeff Ball.
Oh.
So this is a small world. I think Jeff and I shared blocks in either kindergarten, for sure grammar school. And he got all the brains. I thought I was going to be professional MLB or something like that, but it's a really small world. Anyway, went to UCLA and did a few other things, and I'm in the finance area right now. So nice to meet everybody.
Thank you. And Doreen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Doreen. I went to UCLA from 1979 to 1990. I got my bachelor's, master's, and PhD there. And I specialized in autism treatment and came out from after UCLA, got my license and opened the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, CARD. And my timing was ridiculously spot on because unfortunately in 1990, autism had just started to increase. And so I then for 30 years, opened clinics all over the world. And in 2018, when I had 260 clinics, sold 70% of my company to Blackstone and continued as CEO for another 2 years, actually stopped being CEO right at the beginning of 2020. And then I'm still an advisor and on the board for CARD, Center for Autism, and I'm also involved with a number of other autism-related companies, including my charity, which is Autism Care Today.
Thank you. Thank you. And Bonnie, I see you're at the beach as always, so go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Actually, as I was looking outside and it was really gray, I decided the beach background would be much more uplifting to me.
Nice.
Just like you have a beautiful sunny picture of UCLA behind you.
Yep.
I did laugh as I was looking at people's bios, which people I should be classmates with, since my sorority mug says 79 and my diploma says 80. Obviously, it took me more than 4 years to graduate. Anyways, went from UCLA into the business world, then I got an MBA back east because I'd never been there, being LA born and raised. Still the heart is with UCLA. The funny story I always like to tell is that according to my records, I have had season tickets to the football games longer than I've been alive. Might be because they were my parents, who also both graduated from UCLA. So I grew up with, could only wear blue. I couldn't wear red. in my household. I retired coming up on 2 years ago after forever in management consulting, and have been playing volunteer and splitting time between my house in LA and my house in Mammoth, where I love it winter and summer. Glad to meet everybody.
Thank you. Ihab, we'll go with you.
Hello, everyone. Ihab Shahawi. I also went to UCLA as an undergrad, started at UCLA 79, graduated 84, and got introduced to ABA through Dr. Lovas, being there at UCLA and working with Dr. Lovas from 83 to 84 in his program there. And his classes and working with him, changed my life. It put me on this trajectory. And like Doreen said, we couldn't be in a better timing for the explosion of autism and, the need for services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the board. And I didn't, in 96, I started my own company 25 years ago now called Sales, supported independent living services. And Sales was the first company in California to provide applied behavior analysis in a 24-hour residential setting. And we've taken that throughout, we took that throughout the state and into other states as well now. We have also a few years ago opened a company called Patterns Behavioral Services. I bought a small office in Orange County and then built that up. We're in 13 states. We don't have as many as Doreen had as far as ABA clinics, but we have, I think we have 17 right now. But that's our ABA only center-based and in-home services. But the sales group is about a $60 million a year company and continuing to grow. And we're looking at possibly bringing on equity partners as well, in the process of looking at that right now, and looking to grow our Patterns division. And it's an honor to be back towards UCLA. I also went out and got an MBA a few years back, about 10, 11 years ago now. Came back to UCLA and got my MBA there, and super happy with being connected with UCLA and back on track. Thanks to, I've been in touch with Janice over the last few years and collaborating with her on a couple of things. And this is a great opportunity. Thank you for including me.
Thank you. So, I mean, we're already seeing the connections here and the difference, a psychology faculty member can make in terms of career trajectories, which is really inspiring to me. And now I want to introduce one of our very latest PhDs from the department. And you'll hear a little bit more about him, but Victor, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, and thank you, Annette. I am a recent graduate receiving my PhD in social psychology at the end of last year. I went back to being a full-time student after a long career in the entertainment and internet-related worlds. I still haven't given up totally on business. I still have involvement in that world, but my primary interests are UCLA and research. So I'm involved with the Marriage and Close Relationships Lab that exists within UCLA, and it's a phenomenal environment to be involved with. So it's my pleasure to be with all of you today, and I really am excited to hear about all of what you've all accomplished in business. It's kind of, I always thought of myself as being somewhat different when I entered UCLA and kind of combining business background with psychology.
Lots of people do that, and basically almost everybody here has done that. So thank you, Victor. Deborah.
Hello. So I also am bachelor's in psychology with a focus at the time on physiological psychology, and actually worked with John Liebeskin, who unfortunately then, over the years passed away, but a lot of research on pain management, and then got my master's in public health and eventually ended up at Hopkins with a PhD in epidemiology, a lot of focus on infectious diseases, and 20 years at CDC with thinking about everything that bad that can happen. So my lens, unfortunately, for preparedness, you sort of have to be trying to think about what could go wrong, and hopefully it doesn't go wrong. And if it does go wrong, you're sort of ready. So when I finished up with CDC, I thought I was sort of done with this, but got asked to help out at University of Nebraska Medical Center because the dean there is a friend of mine. So that's what I was doing. And with COVID, of course, then pivoted back to a lot of emergency response type of work. Also, I'm connected to UCLA Health Systems through UCLA's Operation Mend, with a lot of work on PTSD, depression, anxiety, and everything related to wounded warriors. So appreciate this opportunity, and hopefully it's a way to give back some. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I had no idea that there was a connection between Jeff and Andrew until, a few seconds ago. So, Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm not sure that it's true that I got the brains. Andrew went into business, I went into psychology. So, so I've been at UCLA. I mean, my mom went to UCLA. I was a UCLA football and basketball fan from the 60s on. So, and I actually don't own anything red either. So as an undergrad at UCLA, I worked in autism research actually with BJ Freeman over in MPI. Sort of the rival Camp to Lovas, and took classes from Lovas though. And then went to clinical psych grad school. I was thinking I was a recent PhD too, but it was 36 years ago. But it doesn't feel like that. And did some autism research and then moved into working with Andy Christensen, actually in the psych department, doing more marital research. Graduated and got a job actually at USC as an assistant professor, did that for a few years, which was very difficult. My office was right over the field where they band practiced every afternoon. So, and then, and I've been teaching at UCLA. I was teaching just intro and abnormal psych for years. And then trained analytically, left USC, worked at the VA hospital part-time and over in Brentwood, and got private practice and did that for years. And then I had an opportunity to work in a psychological treatment center, a residential center, in the 2005, I think. And then I thought it wasn't run very well, but it was an interesting idea, and started my own with a partner in 2010, which is PCH Treatment Center, which has grown. I think we started out with about, 6 or 8 employees, and we've got about 150, 200 now. So it's grown quite a bit. And part of it is we're truly a psychological treatment center. We're not a medical model. I feel like behavioral health needs to move away from the medical model. And so it's been a way where I'm fairly opinionated about treatment and about psychology, and it's a way that I could do it the way I want to do it. So it's been a really interesting experience, and entering the business world, which I only had experience with my private practice, and found I had a knack for doing that. So it's been a lot of fun, and I've always wanted the opportunity to kind of give back to the psych department, because without this department, I wouldn't be where I am now. So really looking forward to all of this.
Thank you so much. As I was having individual meetings with each of you, I started seeing the intersections, the psychology background, but then also a business, an intersection with business, intersection obviously with the application of psychology, intersection with research that is psychologically grounded. And so I am just so thankful to all of you for being the inaugural board, and so excited for this meeting. I thought I'd give you a little update on what psychology has been doing, and then we'll talk about some priorities that your very generous philanthropy will support over this next year, and a couple of choices there, and then we'll also have a couple of our really just fascinating faculty members talking about their research. So let's see. Let's share slides, Olivia, if we can. Okay, that's us. Okay, so when you walked into the building, you walked into Franz Hall, the tower. You walked into the picture on, I think it's your top left. And I actually realized just as I was putting these slides together, how the building used to look. Because it used to look very different now than it looks today. The center was Franz Hall, now is Pritzker Hall. And of course, you see the beloved inverted fountain that the seniors still, on their the last final, the graduating seniors still jump in the fountain and, you know, have champagne and that sort of stuff. So you can always hear them at the end of finals, except unfortunately during the pandemic. But you see the transformation, and we'll be, I hope, I see no reason why, in person for our fall meeting, and we'll be able to take you through some of the sort of highlights of Pritzker. We'll always have a Zoom component because not everybody lives in Los Angeles. And so we'll definitely have a Zoom component, and maybe do a video around when we're actually doing the Pritzker tour. But you see just the complete transformation. And then of course, some of you, I'm sure, remember, if you haven't been here for a while, the right-hand picture is more in classic UCLA architecture tradition. This is the classic Franz Hall that is our westmost building. And then of course we have the building that joins us, that's the psychology building, and that's actually where I'm sitting right now. And so this is what we look like now, basically. And we will be sharing with you all we finished the renovation while everybody was in the pandemic, actually. So several faculty have not seen this building, and most of our graduate students and undergraduates have not seen this renovation. They will be seeing it in the coming months, finally. But we'll also be sending you either our website and or what we call the Tower Book that does have, we are doing naming opportunities for the continued sort of funding of the incredible renovation we were lucky to do with the support of Jeannie and Tony Pritzker. And so you will be seeing those, but it really is obviously an incredible transformation. So then we also will be, let's go to that next slide. So this is, some of you know this, some we talked about in our individual meetings. And you know that we have a leading department in the country. We have the #1 clinical psychology PhD program, according to US News and World Report rankings. We have the #3 graduate psychology program. That's sort of the umbrella of our PhD program. We're high in social psychology, behavioral neuroscience, one of the highest, best global universities for psychology and psychiatry. And also cognitive psychology. Some of our programs, for example, health psychology, is not ranked. And so we have top programs really sort of across the board, with the real star being the standout being our clinical psychology PhD program, but our other programs also very strong. We now have actually 4,000 undergraduate majors. We're the largest undergraduate major at UCLA, and last year unfortunately, our 1,170 graduates at the undergraduate level weren't able to do in-person commencement. We're also doing virtual commencement this year. So we are so large in the Department of Psychology that we actually are in the field house to do our psychology graduation. And so all the families come and guests, but this year our psychology graduation will be online, and we will send you the links for that so that you can see the speeches. We always have an undergraduate speech, so you can see those. But next June, we plan to be in person again over in the field house. We have 78 professors in psychology, from assistant professor to distinguished professor. This also includes some emeritus professors. So it's not that we have 78 active teaching professors, but we still have obviously a large department. We were one, and I didn't know this actually until I became chair, but psychology is among the first graduate programs at UCLA. Began in 1933, so very long history. There was, I'll say this, there was a woman chair about 80 years ago, and that was because another chair passed away, and she was chair for about a year. So I figure about, every 80 years or so, it's sort of good to have a woman chair, and I'm hoping it's working out okay. I'm really enjoying it most of the time. We have about 200 students going for their PhDs at any one time. And this last year, we had an explosion in applications. And so we had 1,661 applications for 40 entering PhD slots. And so those 40 students will be entering in September. But you see that it was tremendously competitive. We've always been competitive, but we had an explosion of applications this past year. And I will say that we just heard from the chancellor this morning that we should be 80% back on campus in terms of the classes that will be offered in September. The very large undergraduate lecture classes still will be remote, still will be online. And we've gotten pretty good at doing those because we've needed to, and we wanted to provide the same kind of education that we always have. But about 80% of our classes will be in person. Housing, undergraduate housing is now opening up much more because of the numbers that we're doing quite well in terms of new cases of COVID. And so we're actually doing quite well now. We just hope it continues. The rate of vaccinations is pretty good. And so we're doing quite well. So we're really looking forward to coming back in the fall. Right now, most of the faculty still are not in their offices. Many of us haven't been able to ramp up our research yet. But so we're really looking forward to ramping up and to seeing most of you in person in the fall. Okay, so let's see. Oh, next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about our PhD program, only so that you can see, those of you who are undergraduates can see the several programs we have for specialization for our PhD programs. And some of them, even some of you who got your PhDs with us, we didn't have all the programs we have now. So we have behavioral neuroscience, clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology. Health psychology is our newest PhD program, and I sit in both clinical and health on the faculties. So I'm a clinical health psychology professor and researcher, learning and behavior, quantitative psychology, and social psychology. One of the things, the developments you see in psychology is that you see the specializations. Quantitative methods has become incredibly more sophisticated in this last decade. And psychology has also always been a leader in developing quantitative methods. And so you see, we have a very strong quantitative PhD program. Victor knows a lot about this. He is also getting very sophisticated and working with one of our star faculty. You also see a new specialization in computational cognition, which again is quite sophisticated kind of approaches to understanding cognition. And then you also see a real progress in psychological neuroscience. So cognitive neuroscience, social neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience has been with us for a long time. And so one of the things I'm going to ask you to do with your generous contributions is support our graduate program, and you'll see that a little bit more today. And let's see, now we also, another thing that we've been doing a lot in addition to really enhancing our graduate programs and maintaining our very large graduate major, we've been doing a lot more outreach to the community, and several of you have been on these events, but okay, you can go to the next slide, Olivia. So some of you, we have a Psychology Presents series, and some of you have been on these. Obviously, they've been online in this past year, and so we had a healthy aging one, we had one on adolescence, we had one on our research in psychology during the time of COVID-19. And these are really to bring psychology to the public. And so many invitations go out to all alumni, many community members, many universities members. And so we've had nearly 1,000 people on one of these, and 900 on another, and I think 500 on another. So this has really been effective, I think, in terms of bringing our new research out to the community, and mostly alumni and friends of psychology. And then another thing that we're doing, and you can change the slide, Olivia. You know what? Yeah, there we go. This is a special, these are very special events that you all, as board members, these are exclusive events that you all have been invited to. And I know some of you are attending. And so we had a conversation between the actress Jennifer Garner and Adriana Galvan talking about child development and adolescence. And I do want to point out that Victor and his wife Loretta very graciously support these events for us. So we can bring this kind of more intimate conversation to a smaller group of people, and you all are invited to any of these we have. I think we got very good feedback on the one that featured Jennifer Garner, who was just wonderful and natural and so interested. When Professor Galvan started talking, Jennifer Garner started taking notes on what Professor Galvan was saying, and so it was really a wonderful conversation. And then I know at least 4 of you, I think, are signed up for our upcoming Psychology Connects, again, an intimate salon with, and then this coming, well, Monday, the 24th, with Michelle Krask, who's one of our absolute stars on our faculty in her research in anxiety and depression, and optimizing treatments, psychological treatments for anxiety and depression, along with Kevin Love, who's an alum and very generously also is contributing to the Department of Psychology to fund a chair, an endowed chair, a permanently endowed chair in psychology, focusing on treatment of anxiety and depression. So this will go to a faculty member very soon. And then Matthew McConaughey, who's also very interested in this conversation is going to be really about more positive well-being and happiness. And so I hope that you all can attend, but I know that at least 3 or 4 of you are going to be coming. So, so that's just a snapshot of what we've been doing, some of our priorities. And so I wanted to see if you want to stop screen share, Olivia, and we can have some discussion or questions, comments on what we've been doing recently. Any thoughts?
It's all very exciting, Annette. Congratulations. I'm really happy to see all the wonderful developments, and it's lovely that you're redoing the building. I heard last that there were a lot of seismic issues, so I assume that's all taken care of. Is the old part of the Franz still called Franz, or did that change as well?
No, the old part of Franz is Franz. So
Okay.
it's Franz Hall. The middle building is now the psychology building, and the tower is now Pritzker Hall.
Got
So
it.
we retain Franz. That's close to our hearts.
Yeah.
But we're also now in completely renovated Pritzker, and Pritzker was completely gutted. So it is
Wow.
inside. It is all new. And what you see, oh, I'm pointing to the screen. You see the sort of diagonals, those diagonals in the front of the building. That's part of the seismic work. And so there was what we were going to do. The university realized that we were actually at risk of, in a major earthquake, the thought was that it would be likely or potentially that the wall, all four walls would just fall down, which wouldn't have been good because a lot of us are in that building. And so they realized they had to do the seismic. It was really urgent, actually, that they did the seismic. Now, they've sort of known this for 20 years, but it became urgent, which was good. And so our dean at that time, Victoria Sork, decided this really was a time that not only do the seismic, but really it was time for a renovation of the building. And so that's when we started with the Centennial Campaign. Tony Pritzker was one of the chairs of the Centennial Campaign to really make this a major effort to do this, to do the building.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Annette, can I just offer two thoughts,
Please.
which relates to everyone on this board of advisors. One is, as a recent graduate, the people now that are going for their PhD, they're kind of the opportunities teaching are somewhat limiting. And there's now much more opportunity in business. So one of the things that I'm very active with in terms of the university is basically making our student body, graduate student body, aware that these opportunities exist. And since all of you have such great backgrounds, you might be interested in that aspect of the future of the psychology department. Second, one thing that I discovered while being at UCLA is the faculty members are just brilliant. They are smart, they have incredible ideas, and people in psychology are not like those in the medical school that are developing IP that's protected by patents. They have entrepreneurial ideas. And I have worked with UCLA and Victoria Sork, who was the prior head of life sciences, to basically allow professors to share in a much more realistic way in the potential profitability of entrepreneurial businesses that don't involve IP and involve a lot of more finance levels at different stages. So it may be something that some of you might be interested in, that we're trying to think of ways of maybe creating a separate program inside of UCLA where people with business backgrounds, both in the school and outside, can help professors think in terms of starting businesses that could result in huge benefits for themselves as well as for the university, also involving corporate America in being interested in UCLA and become potential donors. So that's a big priority for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really interesting, Victor.
Yeah.
I'm super interested. I've been actually talking also with Victoria for a while, and my field being predominantly ABA, and I think my company right now, we have about 6,000 or so employees, and I think it would be something that UCLA professors could easily set up training programs that could staff all ABA clinics. There's a lot of stuff that I feel that could turn into a really good business for some folks at UCLA.
And the opportunities online, even Michelle Cranston, in creating different kinds of ways of short-term treating with depression and anxiety online are potentially huge businesses.
Absolutely.
Now, I always feel like one of the advantages of the degree, I mean, I feel like I've had 3 different careers since I got out of school. And, you know, that you can do so many different things. One of the things that the culture when I was in grad school was very anti doing business. I mean, they didn't even allow graduate students at one point to go to supervisors' private offices because they didn't want people to see how, they didn't want people going into private practice or into business. And so I don't know if that's shifted at all, where there's now, you know, and always one of the gripes was nobody knew how to do anything business-wise because professional schools train that, you know, academic schools did not. So just sort of wondering where that culture is now in terms of being more open to those. Because I think, you know, the impetus was that everyone should go do the Boulder model and become a professor somewhere. Aside from there not being jobs available, it's also felt kind of limited. And that was training I had to kind of gain on my own afterwards.
I think there is an opportunity for teaching the current group of students, graduate and undergraduate, who are thinking of opening their own practices, thinking of going to their own businesses. That piece is just, you know, historically, I know there's something starting at UCLA now, but historically that has not been the case. There hasn't been that training of, you know, yeah, you could become a psychologist, you can become a BCBA, you could become a psychiatrist, but how do you run your business? What's involved with that? And that piece to me just never made sense if that was missing. We all have to kind of figure that piece out for ourselves. So I think there's huge opportunity here from what Victor and Jeffrey are both saying. I agree. I'm on board. Include me, whatever you need.
Yeah. And I'm curious about collaboration. So where is the collaboration, Annette, you might answer this, with the Anderson School, with other parts of campus, even, you know, the Career Center or whatever it's called this week, is how do these things connect together across the campus?
You know, I think it's one of the wonderful things about UCLA that we have psychology. Psychology has been called now a hub discipline because it can be a connector of so many other kinds of areas. And so I should have put it in, I had a slide of psychology's connection to all other I guess there must have been at least a dozen schools or units at UCLA. So we do have faculty who are in Anderson, who are PhDs in psychology, but are on faculty in Anderson. We do have lots of ties, of course, with psychiatry, but also with the larger David Geffen School of Medicine and both the research departments and the clinical departments there. We have a lot of connections with public health, and lots of these are research collaborations, but I think you all are talking about something that's not that collaboration so much. We have many of those established, but really kind of a collaboration to open the possibilities for undergraduates and for graduate students in terms of how can they then start their own businesses, or they're, you know, we are developing some wonderful evidence-based treatments, for example. How can those get out? How can those get disseminated in a way that is both potentially profitable, but also, you know, effective in the community? So I think that this is something, I think it'd be fun maybe in our fall meeting also to talk about this. One of the sort of small ideas I had was to ask actually several of you to come talk to our undergraduates, come talk to our graduate students, because it is true that our department is very, very research focused. and focused in the academy, and focused in evidence-based treatments in terms of our clinical focus. But it's also true that now we're doing many more seminars for the graduate students and speakers for the graduate students to talk about, other ways that psychology can be used in business, in the world, in what Victor's talking about in terms of psychologists working several of our graduates go into tech companies, and so there are many ways we can do that, and that would be a great discussion that we can carry forward from here, especially with your all expertise.
There's some kind of, I signed up for some alumni speaking thing with undergrads on Thursday afternoon. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I said I would do it. But I think that's in the same line of talking about career opportunities to undergraduates.
Yes, we do have that at the university and at the college level, and I think we can do some of that. What I would like to see that happen also is at the psychology major level, because we have our Psychology Honor Society, and there are lots of opportunities that I think that our graduates it would be wonderful for them to know about, just what you can go into.
Well, and as you and I spoke when we spoke before, I've tried to get graduate students over to our treatment center, which is a kind of real world model, applied model of using, and also it's a great research database that we have. We have a research group as well with Jerry Tarlow, who used to run the OCD clinic, and a number of different people participate in that. And I ran into a bit of a roadblock with Cindy Yee Bradbury, who didn't want students leaving the grounds of the department. My friend David Mikulowicz, who's a huge bipolar expert, also said to me he couldn't get anyone to come over and work with him. So one thing that would be great if they could sort of loosen up those requirements, as well as, you mentioned evidence-based therapies, and I think those are important, but they've also become a marketing term and a way for insurance to deny non-evidence-based treatments. And so, I think our place is a good example of where we use a longer term treatment model as well as evidence-based and shorter term, and they all work very well together. So I think there are a lot of opportunities in that kind of program, if we could get the department to kind of, allow students to come over.
Our clinical students, because I sit on that faculty too, our clinical students are getting out into the community more. And many of them are very interested in research that can inform policy and research in the real world. And we have a new director of clinical training coming in this summer. And so, I think that it would be great if, maybe a group would want to meet with him and talk about those kinds of opportunities. That would be great. I'm taking some notes here. Yeah, Andrew?
So I think though, Victor, I think what I'm hearing is two different things. I'm hearing sort of for the professors, the faculty, some type of thing to develop business, and then to reach out to the undergraduates. And I know I spoke, Janice, you had me speak at some event pre-COVID. And I was on the panel with a healthcare expert, and I can't remember the other lady's name, a PhD. And the undergrads had no interest in business when I was speaking. They weren't there yet. And so just that was my experience. I have the other experience, obviously, because I've loved psychology forever. So I think we're talking about two things here that I think are interesting and worth pursuing.
There's a third thing that relates to what Bonnie said, and Annette, I think you've been a big part of this, is the quantitative area in psychology is just brilliant. The people that here are incredible. And Annette has put together a group that's dealing with quantitative methodology through the entire university. Which is really extraordinary, and kind of resources are going in that area, which I just find to be great, because that really adds to doing the best level of research. And it kind of, what we do in research here is virtually the equivalent of artificial intelligence. It's so similar, and people don't understand the kind of abilities that exist within the department. It's fascinating.
And I think the idea of getting psychology research more out there, out of the academic environment, the research I see a lot of it out in the world is medical research, which is terrible. I mean, it's really, statistically, it's bad. It's like they have no control group sometimes. It's funded by pharmaceutical companies. So, there's a lot of fraud involved. And yet that's dictating practice to a great degree. And it'd be great for, psychology to be able to make inroads in terms of that.
There are so many of us who are committed to that. I mean, most of my applied research is with people living with cancer. And so I am out in the community a lot with my research, because if we don't get out into the community, then no matter how effective the treatments are that we develop, they don't go anywhere. And so really getting out in the community, I think, is crucial. So this is a start. Thank you, Victor, for starting this conversation, because I think this is a start of a conversation that we can continue to have and shape, and ultimately will really benefit our undergraduates, our graduate students, and our faculty. So thank you. We should turn to the priorities that I hope that you will be on board with supporting for this next year. And yeah, great. Okay. So what I am hoping that you all approve of is what I would like to do with this first, the generous support you have all contributed will go to, assuming your support, to name a Psychology Board of Advisors graduate scholar. And what we would like to do is to provide a first generation graduate student with support in their first year of graduate study. So your generous donations will actually allow a new graduate student who is admitted through our typical process to be the first Psychology Board of Advisors graduate scholar. And we've already admitted our class for this year, and so this would go toward next year's class, and it would actually allow us in in 2 years basically to support 2 incoming graduate scholars. One of the things that's very difficult about graduate school, although we create jobs for our graduate students, they become teaching assistants. Many of them very successfully compete for external funding, like National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health kind of funds during their graduate school. They can also serve as TAs, they can serve as research assistants here, but it's really important that we support our graduate students in really a more fundamental and expanded way. And so what we'd like to start is the inaugural Psychology Board of Advisors graduate scholar. And that also will very likely increase the diversity of our class. It will allow us to increase our class size, because so many faculty, of course, their labs, the excitement in their labs comes from their PhD students. And so this is what I would intend to do, assuming your support with this first year's funding. And then the next priority I'd like to do is, as Victor said, our faculty are brilliant. I really agree with that. And what I'd like to do with the remaining funds from this year, because your funds will support a full year of training for a graduate scholar, and there will be some remainder. And so what I'd like to do is also create some small Psychology Board of Advisors faculty grants. And that could go toward training and materials to enhance undergraduates for graduate teaching and mentoring. It can go toward pilot research. So we're talking here, you know, a couple of $1,000 or $3,000 to $4,000, no more than, I'm thinking $4,000 or $5,000 per project. And pilot research is essential for being able to support larger research projects and apply successfully for grants from the NIH, et cetera, to do our research, or, you know, potentially conference travel. So this, I would love your support for the first one, for the graduate scholar. And then this is my second idea to support our really wonderful faculty. And my questions for you would be, does it make sense to offer these for teaching, research, and travel, these small grants? And should we focus on assistant professors or all professors? The assistant professors actually have some advantage because the UCLA always gives assistant professors good startup packages. So they already have some funds to do some of this pilot research, travel, et cetera. So I was thinking maybe the full faculty could apply for these. And so those are the two priorities that we would have for this, this coming year in the fall. And I hope that you will support them. So can you put us all back on, Olivia? Okay, and I just need to see everybody. So I wanted to just have some very quick discussion before we bring Jennifer Sumner on. Hi, Jennifer. To ask you whether those sound like good priorities for the board's great philanthropy for this year, and whether anybody had any opinion about especially the faculty grants. Is it okay that they go for teaching, research, or travel, or should we focus on one of those? And is it okay to give them to all faculty, or should we focus on the assistant professors? Anybody have opinions?
Where do you travel to?
Conferences. So typically we're invited to speak at conferences, and now we'll be opening up travel. And so, for example, next month I should be in Scotland giving a talk. I would never accept one of your grants for me. Of course, you know, I would be ruled out there. But I should be in Scotland, but instead I'm going to be on a Zoom talking about my research. So typically the travel is for conferences and talks across the country and sometimes across the world. Jeff?
And it's an interesting point about Zoom. You know, I used to travel probably once a month to both conferences and visit other treatment centers and promote my business. I can't tell you how much money we've saved in the last year from myself and a marketer, another person going out to New York or something like that. And we haven't seen a huge drop off in terms of the quality of connection. In some ways, it's easier to assemble people on Zoom than it is in person.
Yeah.
So, you know, in some ways, I think, you know, only essential travel should be kind of maximized, where you can't, you know, be as effective, you know, as, for example, in a Zoom thing. Just I thought about it.
You know, that's a good point. And we don't know what conferences are going to look like in the future. And so we may not, especially in this next year, it'll be hard to tell that landscape. And I think the essential travel probably is the most important, but frankly, I think the research and the teaching small grants are more important. And so I would be very happy to take the travel off the board, because research and the teaching are really more our hearts anyway. Bonnie, were you going to say something?
Well, I think it's interesting. I know I was just talking to some of my friends at Google, and one of their views is that they've asked all their engineers to come back. And one of the big reasons for that is that while the work needed to happen is getting done, they are completely lacking innovation. That with Zoom and conference calls and working remotely, all the work's getting done, but there's no new inventions. There's no conversations over, the late night meal that they bring in, because they provide them a lot of food, and those conversations aren't happening. And they're very worried about that. So I don't know how that is going to play out in academia, but that's one of the things that's playing out in business.
That's, I think that is the power of conferences in some ways, because you end up having those late night talks. You end up having collaborations that you would never have thought about before. You have ideas based on, a chat with somebody after they give a talk. And so I think that is important. Although I think going into this next year, we might want to just focus on because so many of us are getting back to research. We really might want to focus on the research and the teaching.
Yeah, you may have collaboration internally first.
Right.
Before you get to the external collaboration. I just don't want to take it completely off the table, because I know what the ideas come up over a drink at 10 o'clock at night as often as they come up someplace else.
Yep, so true.
And if I could just add, I wasn't saying take travel off, but just like we're doing a Zoom right now, lots of times people will text everybody. And at the end of the day, it's like, pick up the phone and call me. Because when you talk to somebody, it's easier when you're actually talking to someone. And the same thing when you're actually meeting with someone, even on a Zoom, it's still not the same as meeting someone face to face. So
I so agree, I have to say. What do you think? Are these two ideas, supporting a board of advisors, graduate scholar, and doing small grants? Are you all on board for those? Everybody okay?
On board.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. That's what we'll go with. Thank you. And I will be able to update you in our fall meeting. But now let's turn it over. You see Professor Jennifer Sumner is with us. She is going to talk with us about some of her exciting research. Jennifer is she sits in both our health psychology and our clinical psychology faculty. And she is an assistant professor and just is doing some fabulous research that she's going to share with you for a minute.
Great, thank you everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. I'm just going to take a minute to share my screen. Great, this is excellent. So as Annette mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of our latest findings on PTSD and cardiovascular risk. But first, I just want to take a minute just to describe more broadly some of the work that we do in my lab. So in my lab, we really are interested in trying to understand how do the experiences of trauma and severe stress contribute to accelerated aging and risk for chronic disease. And in particular, we're interested in understanding the mechanisms of risk that link experiences of severe stress and trauma with adverse physical health outcomes. And the work in my lab can be thought of as falling within sort of 4 broad domains or categories. A lot of my work focuses on PTSD and risk for cardiovascular disease, the leading cause of death and disability worldwide. In addition, we often focus on the physical health impact of trauma, specifically in women. I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we do in this area today with you. But in addition, some of our work also touches on the biological embedding of early life adversity. So how do early experiences of adversity get under the skin to contribute to accelerated aging and risk for disease down the line? And then also appreciating how genetic and epigenetic factors may play a role in the link between PTSD and physical health. And so what we know is that trauma is common. So it's estimated that the vast majority of individuals will experience at least one traumatic event during their lifetime. And when we're talking about trauma, this encompasses a wide range of experiences, from combat to being in a natural disaster, to experiencing assault, to having the sudden and very unexpected death of a loved one. And what we know is that although most individuals are resilient after trauma exposure, a sizable portion go on to experience emotional difficulties. And of those, PTSD really is thought to be the quintessential trauma-related mental disorder. So it's characterized by symptoms of re-experiencing of the traumatic event, avoidance of trauma reminders, negative changes in thoughts and feelings, as well as hyperarousal, so feeling keyed up or on edge. And these symptoms all last for at least 1 month after trauma. But what we see is that the impact doesn't just end with the mind. Instead, trauma and PTSD can also have important implications for physical health. And when it comes to physical health, cardiovascular disease is an especially important public health concern. And a large and growing research body has really linked PTSD with increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease, but this has been done in predominantly male samples of veterans. And it really is important to be studying the link, specifically looking at PTSD and CVD in women veterans. So for one, we see that PTSD is actually twice as common in women than in men. So while the overall lifetime prevalence of PTSD is around 8%, we see that about 1 in 10 women, so those shown here in red, will develop PTSD in their lifetime, as opposed to 1 in 20 men. And furthermore, PTSD has been found to be more chronic, severe, and impairing in women than in men. And not only is PTSD more common and impairing in women than in men, but we also see that sex differences exist in cardiovascular disease. So for example, symptoms of CVD can differ for women and men. So women often present, say, with a heart attack with symptoms like nausea or dizziness, and not as often with, like, say, the left arm pain that men may present with when having a heart attack. We also see that certain CVD risk factors may be unique to or more potent in women than in men. So for example, factors that may be unique to women include things like gestational hypertension and diabetes, as well as early menopause. Whereas factors that may be more potent in women include things like smoking, diabetes, as well as psychosocial factors. And despite a number of efforts to address sex differences in the incidence and mortality from CVD, we see that the incidence of high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease has been rising in women, particularly younger women. And this is as young as women between the ages of 35 and 55. And so over the past several years, my colleagues and I have addressed this limitation by examining how trauma exposure and PTSD symptoms are related to the onset of a range of cardiovascular conditions in a large sample of women living in the community. And in this work, we've been able to demonstrate that PTSD precedes and predicts the development of traditional cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension, acute CVD events like having a heart attack or a stroke, and even more rare events like developing blood clots in your veins. However, despite this important work to address this gap, we see that there's a group of women who remain understudied when it comes to the PTSD and CVD link, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And that group is women veterans. So although women once comprised a small percentage of veterans, the absolute number of women veterans has steadily increased over the past 2 decades. And what we see is that 10% of the over 20 million US veterans currently are women. And women veterans are fast-growing users of the Veterans Health Administration, which is the largest integrated healthcare system in the US. So we saw that between 2000 and 2015, the number of women veteran users of the VHA nearly tripled. And women veterans also look quite different from their men veteran counterparts. So for example, they're younger. So by 2015, nearly 90% of women veterans were younger than age 65, whereas the majority of men veterans were age 65 and older. And women veterans have also been more consistently diverse in race and ethnicity compared to men veterans. And so this really suggests that we just can't extrapolate findings from men veterans and assume that they're going to really reflect how PTSD may have cardiovascular consequences for women veterans. And in addition, as highlighted here in a recent call to action that was published in Circulation, women veterans also face a unique set of cardiovascular risk factors that are actually distinct from those faced by either civilian women in the community, or men veterans. So again, really highlighting the need to be studying these associations and really to better the health of our women veterans. And so my colleagues and I, both at UCLA as well as the West LA VA, received funding from the Department of Defense so that we could examine these associations of PTSD with cardiovascular outcomes, specifically in women veterans. And so to do so, we've been able to examine the rich information within the VHA electronic medical record to look to see the extent to which PTSD predicts the first onset of cardiovascular disease in women veterans. And so I'll walk you through this project now that we've been embarking upon. So as I mentioned before, we're using information in the VHA EMR, electronic medical record, and we've been doing that to identify women who engaged with the VHA between January 2000 and December 2017, so nearly a 20-year period. And because we were interested in predicting first onset of cardiovascular disease, we wanted to exclude any women who had a previous history of cardiovascular disease. So doing so resulted in nearly 760,000 women veterans who could be available for our analytic sample. And so what we did is we engaged in a technique called propensity score matching, which allowed us to generate our analytic sample. And so with this propensity score matching, we wanted to be able to balance our groups of women veterans with and without PTSD on a number of different factors that could increase risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And so we matched based on things like age at index visit, the year of index visit, the number of prior healthcare visits they had, as well as the presence of traditional cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension and smoking. But in addition, female-specific CVD risk factors that often have not been included in prior research, things like gestational hypertension or diabetes, in addition to a variety of mental and physical health conditions like depression, anxiety, obesity, and neuroendocrine disorders. And so we really aim to be comprehensive in our approach here to balance these two groups. And so for women veterans with PTSD, their index visit date, the date that we used to start our follow-up of these women, was the date when they were first defined by a diagnosis of PTSD in the EMR. And then for each patient without PTSD, they didn't have a comparable date for their index visit because they never were diagnosed with PTSD. So what we did is we identified all possible visits that they had in the EMR. And then we basically matched the distribution of our index visit dates for those women veterans without PTSD so that they matched those of the women with PTSD. And because we were using the electronic medical data, we were able to harness information about a whole host of these different conditions indicated by diagnostic codes that were provided for by healthcare providers. And so this generated a large sample for analyses of women veterans. So just over 130,000 women veterans with PTSD and just over 265,000 women veterans without PTSD. And so at index visit, these women are about 40 years of age on average. The sample was 30% Black and 8% Hispanic and Latina. And so then we followed these women to see who would go on to experience a first onset of cardiovascular disease. And we had a median length of follow-up of nearly 5 years. And we defined cardiovascular disease as new onset coronary artery disease, angina, or heart attack diagnoses as indicated either again by diagnostic codes in the EMR or coronary intervention codes also documented in the medical record. And so using this matched sample, we were able to conduct survival analyses to estimate hazard ratios and 95% confidence intervals to estimate the association of PTSD with incident CVD. And then in addition, given the younger and diverse makeup of women veterans that I mentioned earlier, we were interested in examining associations that were also stratified by age, race, and ethnicity. And so we found that PTSD was significantly associated with heightened CVD incidence in our sample, such that PTSD was associated with a 44% higher rate of developing cardiovascular disease over follow-up. These results were just recently published in JAMA Cardiology. And then in addition, our stratified analyses identified women veteran subgroups for whom the PTSD CVD link was particularly pronounced. And so we found in part that even though PTSD and CVD was associated in women of all ages, the strongest associations were in our youngest group of women, and then they got smaller with increasing age. So you see here, that first group of women who are less than 40 years of age at index visit, they actually showed the strongest association. And if anything, we were just amazed to even begin to document associations in women that young in terms of this link between PTSD and CVD. We also found that racial and ethnic minorities showed pronounced associations of PTSD with incident CVD. So again, even though PTSD was associated with an increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease for all groups, it really was Black women, women of other race who showed some of the strongest associations or greatest associations, as well as Hispanic and Latina women. So to summarize these findings, here in this research, we were able to extend work linking PTSD to adverse cardiovascular outcomes, specifically to younger women veterans. And we found effect sizes that were actually quite similar, though, to men veterans, as well as community-based women. In our investigation, this really represents a comprehensive consideration of cardiovascular risk factors. So as I mentioned earlier, we were able to account for a wide range of different risk factors in our propensity score matching, including some female-specific risk factors that often haven't been accounted for in previous research. And our work suggested that the risk associated with PTSD was greatest in younger women, as well as racial and ethnic minorities. And especially our findings with respect to age actually parallel some of my previous research looking at PTSD in community-based samples of women, and also parallels some work looking at other psychosocial factors like depression and stress that have been particularly associated with cardiovascular risk in younger women, suggesting that we really may be finding something sort of unique to this age group here that may be especially important to appreciate. And we think that our results have implications for cardiovascular risk screening. So thinking about potentially earlier and more aggressive CVD risk assessment, monitoring and management in vulnerable women veterans. So in terms of some of our next steps with respect to research, we're interested in examining some of the underlying mechanisms that it may explain some of these associations between PTSD and CVD. It's been proposed that both behavioral as well as biological pathways may underlie these associations. So things like engaging in unhealthy behaviors like cigarette smoking, eating an unhealthy diet, not getting enough physical activity, as well as changes associated with dysregulation of the physiological stress response that can have adverse consequences downstream for cardiovascular health. We're going to be casting a wide net, looking at additional cardiovascular outcomes, and we're especially able to do so because of the rich data located within the EMR and our very large sample size of women veterans. And then finally, too, considering the role of pharmacotherapy. So how may certain medications actually either further increase or potentially attenuate the association of PTSD with cardiovascular outcomes? We know that women veterans are often receiving a number of medications, and especially polypharmacy. And so can we be able to really further understand either different combinations of risk or factors that may help to mitigate risk as well? So I want to thank you so much for your attention today. Again, it's a pleasure to be able to meet with fellow Bruins and connect over our love of psychology. If you're interested in learning more about my lab, I have some more information here, as well as my email contact. So thank you again for your time.
Wow, Dr. Sumner, that was a fantastic presentation. And it's amazing that you have a 44% increase, even controlling for all those other risk factors. We're a little bit short on time. Our discussion went a little long, but does somebody have maybe one comment or question for Professor Sumner? Yeah, Jeff.
I was curious about a couple of things about if you've looked at complex PTSD, which is a much broader definition, but also have you seen a film called Medicating Normal?
So yeah, I haven't heard the film. I'm going to have to add that to my queue of ones to look at. So thank you for that recommendation. In terms of the complex PTSD question, I think that's a really great comment. So within the electronic medical record, we don't have that level of documentation in terms of that granularity with respect to complex PTSD, but we do often see that women with early life adversity histories, which is linked with complex PTSD, do often show even more pronounced increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And even in and of itself, that early life adversity has also been associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So I think that there's a lot of ways we can really try to unpack the manifestations of PTSD, and especially in more detailed research, when we're bringing people in from the community, say, able to assess a number of manifestations of PTSD in more nuanced ways that can be informed by this kind of larger kind of sample research in that way.
And I bring up medicating normal. We're actually going to be screening it.
Oh, great.
But I've spoken with them. It's a really interesting. It's about an hour and 15 minutes, but it's the main character is a woman veteran who comes back with severe trauma, but is misdiagnosed and put on lots of antidepressants and becomes suicidal. And so it's very much about kind of diagnosis and pharmacotherapy, creating iatrogenic damage, basically. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important to be able to really be able to, accurately identify what's going on for individuals and get them, the treatment that is so important to be able to address these underlying issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. That was a fantastic presentation, really interesting findings. And what you see, I think, in our faculty is this incredible sophistication and growing sophistication at every level of analysis. So biological, psychological, social, that we see so much in Jennifer Sumner's work. So thank you. And I will turn the stage over to Professor Martin Monti. Professor Monti, his interest, his two areas are in cognitive psychology and in behavioral neuroscience. And he's doing fascinating work on levels of consciousness. So Martin.
Good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of the ongoing work in my lab. So let me start by sharing my screen. Okay, let's see if this works. Right away, almost. Is my screen visible?
Perfect.
Wonderful. So I'd like to, as I was saying, share a little bit of the work that is going on in my lab. And we focus on what are known as acquired disorders of consciousness. But let me start by asking you a question. And if you want, you can raise your hand to say yes or no. But the question is this: are you conscious? And it feels like such an easy question to answer. It probably took you less than a blink of an eye to say, of course I am. In fact, it feels so easy to answer that you might be wondering why I'm asking you this question. And see, on the one hand, it's extremely easy to answer this question for ourselves. What is much harder is to look at someone else and tell, is this other person conscious like me? And the difference is that you have access to your own feelings of being an agent in the world, of experiencing what is happening around you. But you never get to have access to somebody else's feeling of being an agent and of being, of experiencing the world. And on the one hand, this sometimes feels like a bit of an academic question, maybe a philosophical question, but actually it's an extremely important question when we start discussing other individuals who survive severe brain injuries and find themselves, although they survive the event, they don't fully recover, and they enter what is known as a disorder of consciousness. Let me give you an example. So this is what I focus on, and this is a clip of a patient who narrowly survived a severe brain injury, and she awakened from the state of coma. And we're now trying to understand, is she conscious or not? Look at her eyes. We asked her to follow this object with her eyes. And you're there, you're the clinician. And the question is, her eyes are open. She clearly wakes up and falls asleep. or at least looks like she does, like much like you and I do. But is she conscious? And we're left having to find ways to access the thoughts or try to access these patients and understand if they are having an experience of consciousness or not, if they are experiencing what's around them, and how much brain function do they actually retain. And see, so my lab is divided more or less into 3 different parts. There are 3 broad questions that we ask. One is what I just asked you. How do we tell if someone is conscious or not? And this turns out to be a very tricky question and a very difficult question to answer, particularly in the clinical domain. Then we ask questions such as, what is the difference? Why do some brains maintain a state of consciousness, can generate a state of consciousness, and why under other conditions, a brain is no longer able to maintain, to generate a state of consciousness? And finally, what can we do to help patients who do not fully recover after a coma and remain in this limbo? Can we do something to help them recover if they don't recover spontaneously? Just to make a little more concrete what I'm talking about, typically in my lab, we focus on 3 conditions. You're probably familiar with the term coma. This indexes patients. Typically, they appear from the outside as if they were asleep. They never open their eyes, and they appear, you can try to stimulate them. They never show any sign of consciousness. Now, some patients from a coma wake up and recover cognitive function and consciousness and actually go on to make remarkable recovery. A sliver of patients, less than 10% of patients who suffer a severe brain injury, enters the limbo of a vegetative state, which is a circumstance where patients open their eyes, wake up and fall asleep, or at least look as if they were waking up and falling asleep, but don't show any sign of being aware of themselves or of their environment. And some of these patients remain in this condition for the rest of their biological life. Some patients also recover the ability to say, to demonstrate that they're conscious. And this typically comes in the form of blinking on command, or wiggling toes, or moving a finger, or something, sticking their tongue out, something of that sort. And this condition, again, patients can either remain in it for the rest of their biological life, or they can actually further recover. And of course, the first question is, well, but how do we tell if a patient is conscious or not? And I just want to give you one example before showing you the one study I want to present. In the video you've just seen, patients are asked to do something to show us that they are there, that they can understand and that they are conscious. What if a patient were perfectly conscious, but just couldn't move? I mean, these are patients who suffered severe brain injuries, so it is conceivable. And see, under that circumstance, there's nothing that could be done to see and to assess that such a patient is conscious, if minimally. And so years ago, we developed a test to actually get around this problem. See, maybe a patient cannot wiggle their toes, or cannot stick their tongue out, cannot blink on command when I ask them, but maybe if they hear me and understand me, they can think of something, and I can see it using neurotechnologies such as MRI. So if I asked you right now to close your eyes, if you want, you can try it. Close your eyes just a moment and imagine playing tennis. Can you do that? Close your eyes and imagine you're on a tennis field and you're swinging a racket. Very good. If I thank you, you can open your eyes. And the second thing I could have you do, although you don't have to do it, I could have you close your eyes and imagine being in a place you know well, your home, for example, and just walk around all the rooms that that are in your house and imagine everything you'd be seeing. If I could take a picture of the functional activity in your brain as you're doing these 2 tasks, 2 very different parts of your brain will get very excited. And they don't have much to do with the exact tasks like tennis over other things, but just some parts of the brain that you see here depicted in orange are very important for complex motor sequences. And so as you imagine playing tennis, this part of your brain gets excited. So I can ask a patient to do the exact same thing, and they don't have to move. All they have to do is, if they've understood me, start thinking what I asked them. Turns out some patients, a small number, but some patients appear to be unconscious when we ask them, when we do clinical tests, but in fact can demonstrate using these technologies but they actually are conscious, if minimally. It doesn't mean that they have the full conscious experience like you and I do, but they certainly have some level of consciousness more than what they can show in clinical tests. So this is just one example of how we use neurotechnologies in order to understand these patients. Now, the second question, in fact, sorry, the third, is what can we do to help these patients? And of course, we need to understand why these patients are not recovering consciousness. And it turns out that if you were to look, if your brain were transparent and you can look at in the center of it, you would see two nuclei known as the left and right thalamus. They don't quite host consciousness. Consciousness is not in there, but they're really important for the brain. They're a hub of information. They're really important for the brain and for cortex in particular, the outer layers of the brain, to do what they do. And these regions appear to be, are damaged in proportion to how deep is the impairment in these patients. So we have a target. And in fact, a colleague of mine in New York has put some electrodes into the thalamus, which you're seeing here. And this helps. This helps patients recover. However, less than 10% of these patients can actually undergo this procedure. So my group thought, can we do the same procedure without having to do a surgery? Can we cast a wide net and not just have less than 10% of our patients have some intervention that can help them, because there's no existing therapy for these patients? And so we started working with a company here in Los Angeles known as BrainSonics to develop a new technique known as low intensity focused ultrasound. It's very similar to conventional ultrasound that you're probably familiar with, except rather than scattering energy across the brain, we focus energy in a small piece of the brain, which you're seeing here depicted. And this is just, it's just a cartoon. We can use a focused ultrasound transducer, which is this big device that you see out here. And we can maybe stimulate a deep part of the brain without having to do surgery. So that's the mission that we embarked on. Nobody has ever used this technology this way. We are the first to do this. And in fact, what I'm showing here, this is the ultrasound transducer, and it's inside a bucket of water. You're seeing it from above. If you look in the middle, you'll see the water vibrate. That's what we're doing to these neurons. We're vibrating the neurons into activity. It just so happens that certain patterns of vibrations increase neural activity. And so we can deposit energy. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip one slide just because I already said that. And so we can deposit energy in the center of a brain of patients. And for this reason, we launched a first-in-man clinical trial. And as you're seeing here, we recruited 9 patients. We had a full schedule until last September. And of course, the world suddenly changed. So I'm going to present what we had done up to when we could be doing science. And what we do is we bring to us patients who are in a disorder of consciousness chronically, which means they've been in this condition for over a year. And typically after a year, the chances of recovery are diminished with time. And what we do is we bring them to us, we do a clinical test, then we come to focused ultrasound, then we do another test, and then we repeat this 1 week later. Okay, so in fact, you can see right here what we do. We bring patients to UCLA. We bring them with an ambulance to UCLA from wherever they reside. We administer ultrasound inside the MRI machine. It's an MR guided procedure. And then we do various clinical tests to see if they improve or not. Then we do ultrasound again, and then we do various tests, and we try to follow them over time. And I just want to tell you the story of one patient before showing you sort of the aggregate. So this was our very first patient, in fact, in this cohort. This patient comes to us and has a diagnosis of a minimally conscious state. So this patient can show small signs that he is conscious. By the way, I should say, the clinical score that you're seeing on this axis, the higher, the better. Okay, the higher, the more responsive the patient is. So this is the day before at their home. We bring the patient to us. The patient undergoes ultrasound. And typically we see this almost always, the scores decrease a little bit. And this just has to do with putting these patients through at times 1, 2, 3 hour travel plus several hours inside the MRI machine. Then we go see them 1 week later. And what we see is that by that point, patients typically are doing better. This patient could answer questions by looking up and looking down for the very first time. In fact, what happened is that I go see them. The wife looks at me and the first thing she says is, I want more of this. So of course I ask her, why is the case? And she tells me, I've had the first conversation with my husband since the accident. She noticed that he could look up and down on command. And so she started showing him pictures and asking him, do you recognize this person? Is this person such and such? And he would look up or down to say yes or no. And we could validate that ourselves by asking him to do that sort of when we were testing him. So clearly the patient could do something that he had never been able to do for over 2 years. Then we do our second session of ultrasound. Now the patient for the first time can take an object and bring it a cup and bring it to his mouth. That's another thing he had never been able to do. And then again, 1 week later, we go see him. The patient now can respond to questions systematically, which means the patient is no longer in a disorder of consciousness. The patient has exited a disorder of consciousness. And this is in 2 weeks after over 2 years, not progressing. Unfortunately, over time, it seems that our treatment, when we tested this patient months later, it seems that the patient regressed. So it is possible that we might have to do these treatments multiple times. But this clearly shows that we can affect the system. Seen as a group, our patients overall all increased by over 1.5 points in the clinical scale, which is the kind of changes that you've seen. Okay, they can start responding to questions, or they can blink on command when they couldn't do it before. If you just took a random cohort of these patients that did not undergo ultrasound, and you see how they do over time, they don't change. So a historical cohort that we had, they don't change over time. They're stable, which is consistent with what we know by definition. So clearly we're showing that there is something to this technology. So just to sort of summarize this, we've been developing this very promising technique that might be able to help. And again, there's no other path for these patients. Patients who are in a disorder of consciousness. In a sense, it's what I like calling the best of both worlds. We can modulate deep parts of the brain with a non-invasive technique, which nobody has been able to do before us. This is the very first example of stimulating deep parts of the brain without surgery. And it has an excellent safety record. In our trial, we've had no serious adverse events. We had a couple adverse events, but they were related to travel, not to exposure. And finally, this really seems to show that there's some really exciting preliminary data of therapeutic effectiveness in these patients. I have to warn you, this was a first-in-man trial, which means it was not double blind. It was a proof of concept. So we really have to do this next in a much more sort of, now that we have this initial data, we have to do it in a much more careful and standardized way. Which leads me to the last slide, which is what we want to do, with the next steps being actually doing a more careful clinical trial when we can compare patients who do or do not get ultrasound, and in particular understand why some patients are susceptible to this and others seem to be less susceptible, which might help us select patients properly. And of course, the one that I care in particular, which is casting a wide net. This technology is fairly inexpensive, and I think we can make it portable. So instead of having patients having to travel and come to us, we might actually be able to turn this into something that we could bring to a patient's home, much like an ultrasound that you see on a cart in a hospital. So that is sort of where I hope all of this is going. And with this, thank you very much. And I'd gladly take any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Professor Monti. You want to take down your slides? Thank you so much. You see the kind of incredible work that we have going on in the department. Does anybody have one question? Yeah, Doreen.
I just, I thought I saw in the slides that on your, the experimental group, you had like a wide standard deviation. Is there a lot of variability, and like, how are you going about identifying which patients are high responders?
It's a very good question. There are two parts to that. On the one hand, yes, there absolutely is variability. And I think the point you made is in fact, one clinical trial that we have currently under review at the NIH is exactly for that, trying to understand why some patients respond more than others. What are the biological variables that make one patient susceptible to this treatment and another patient less or not susceptible to this treatment? And that will be very important for us so that we know which patients can benefit. The other aspect is that unfortunately, this is a small sample size. So we don't benefit from sort of having larger numbers to bring down those standard errors. Absolutely.
Well done, though. Very, very interesting studies. Wonderful.
Thank you. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. And I think it does, I mean, it really actually connects with some of what we've been talking about in terms of partnering with business, partnering with a technology company to do the kind of work you're doing, which is obviously really incredible. I mean, if you have a wife saying, "You brought my husband back," that's just remarkable. So thank you so much. And we should close, and I hope you all have enjoyed this first meeting of us. It feels like we should go over to the Luskin Center and now have a little something to drink and eat and talk so that we can all get to know each other even better. But we'll have our upcoming meeting in the fall. We'll connect with you by email. We'll be back in touch with you via email in terms of the kinds of, I so appreciate you supporting the priorities of the psychology department. You're going to make a graduate student's life so much easier, as well as faculty lives. So I so appreciate that. And we will be in touch. I know I'm going to see at least a few of you with Matthew McConaughey and Kevin Love and Professor Krask, and that will be really fun. So that's sort of my closing. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying on a little bit late, and we'll see you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye.